Hello there Scapers, my name is Zenevilius and welcome to this video where I'm going to be doing some pretty in-depth analysis of all the different Bakriminel bolts to see which one is actually the best in what situation. It's going to be far more in-depth than my previous Bakriminel bolts video, which I released one day after they got updated. So if you want to have a quick overview, I say quick, it's not exactly quick, but if you want to have a basic overview before you see this video, feel free to see it, but you can see this video on its own as well because it will be more detailed. So I slaved away for many hours over the past few weeks at dummies. One type of dummy was the Lumbridge dummy, the second type was Magister. Those were my two test cases for testing out all these bolts, and hopefully you guys will find all the results of that pretty useful. So let's have a look at all the bolts on their own, comparing with the T90 bolts, i.e. Ascension bolts, which don't have any effects, but they will be used as a base case to compare these bolts to. So first things first, some general facts about how the bolts work. So the enchanted Bakriminel bolts are used up at a rate of 1 bolt per auto attack and 1 bolt per proccing. By proccing I mean the activation of the enchantment effect. The enchantment effect doesn't proc with bleeds, which is a very key fact. This includes fragmentation shot and corruption shot. However, it does proc with channeled abilities. Each hit of a channeled ability has a chance of proccing it. This makes it extremely powerful when you're using abilities such as Rapid Fire, Onslaught, and Deadshot, just to name a few. Interestingly, these bolts can grant you up to tier 95 damage. However, the damage that you do is capped at the minimum out of your weapon level or your ammo level. Obviously your weapon level, the highest tier crossbows as of now are tier 90 crossbows, so it's capped at tier 90 damage, even though the Bakriminel bolts can do up to tier 95 damage. However, when the Solak crossbows get released, they will of course be tier 92 crossbows, therefore the Bakriminel bolts will still do tier 92 damage. In fact, until tier 95 crossbows come out, the Bakriminel bolts will be useful and they will still do tier 95 damage. If for some reason Jagex decide to release a tier 96 crossbow, then there will be no difference between using Bakriminel bolts with a tier 95 weapon as compared to a tier 96 weapon. Now this is the key point that I've been finding out about over the last few weeks. The hit damage on your proc is increased by things like your prayers, any boosted levels, for example using overloads or the reckless aura, void knight equipment, and needle strike. All of these affect the hit that you do when you proc. This is particularly pertinent to the Ruby bolts E-spec, which I will come on to later. It's very important to note down these facts because later on when I discuss it they will come into the picture. And finally, probably the most important point is that if you want to get the most out of these bolts, you really want to have completed the Elite Seer's Village Diaries so that you can get a flat plus 2% proc chance. A few assumptions then. I'm going to assume that all things considered, it takes 1.5 seconds between hits that are eligible for proccing. So hits that aren't eligible, of course, bleeds. Hits that are eligible are channeled abilities. So I guess these two balance out. It's slightly more in favor of channeled abilities, I reckon. Especially if you're using some of these bolts, I would recommend that you actively try not to use bleed so that you have a high chance of proccing, unless of course it's situation dependent. So all things considered, even though the global cooldown is 1.8 seconds, I'm going to say it's 1.5 seconds per hit. I'm going to assume your player LP is 10k. This is mainly for the Ruby bolt spec. I'm also going to assume that whenever you death swiftness, it's for 37.8 seconds. That is, you have the planted feet perk active. I'm also going to assume that this is a very subjective, but it's not entirely random that I chose the number of 4,000 as the average hit I'm going to assume you do per hit that you do across every single hit. So you might do 12k with a tendril, fine. You might do 1k with a piercing shot or something. All that averages out to around 4k per hit, let's assume, in any given rotation. And of course that's increased by 50% with death swiftness to 6k. And the Ruby bolts, whenever they proc, they have a unique effect. In fact, most of the time they will hit a 12k critical hit. Sometimes it will be a 10k normal hit, but I'd say 90-95% of the time it's 12k. And this is only if you are above the monster's LP threshold, which I'll come on to later. But this is the assumption I'm going to make. I'm also going to assume that the monster has less than 1 mil LP, so that the Ruby bots have the highest chance of proccing, which is 5%. It goes down to 4% between 1 to 2 mil LP, 3% between 2 to 3 mil, and so on until until it's capped at 1% for any monster with LP more than 4 million. Okay, so let's have a look at all the bolts in the same picture. Now I'm going to ignore the lowest level bolts except for Opal because I don't think they're worth discussing here, although they might have very niche sort of applications, such as the Emerald bolts have a chance of poisoning your enemy, the Sapphire bolts work against monsters that are weak to water spells, the Jade bolts have a 5% chance of stunning your target for 4.8 seconds. So everything here is going to be compared to the T90 Ascension bolts, which are the base case, which don't have any effect of course, but there will be what these are going to be compared to, assuming of course you're going to be using Ascension crossbows. So for the Opal Bakriminel bolts, they have a 5% chance of proccing per hit, which means on average it's 30 seconds between hits, which also means on average it's 2 procs per minute or 120 procs per hour. The damage that you do every time you proc, the extra damage that you do with the bolt effect, is 10%, so that comes out to 0.5% damage per hit on average, and assuming that you do 4k damage per hit on average, that's an extra 800 damage. And as of yesterday, each bolt costs 4k GP, so the cost per minute on average is 8k. Now I'm going to skip over Ruby and Diamond here because I'm going to analyze those separately. Those are very situation dependent. So let's have a look at Dragonstone Bakriminel bolts E. Again, 5% chance, but this time, each time it procs, you do 25% extra damage in the form of a dragon fire attack, i.e. a magic hit on your monster. So that means you do on average 1.25% extra DPS with these bolts, which means on average you do an extra 2k damage with these bolts. That's pretty significant per minute, that is. The cost is actually slightly less, so you do more damage for less cost. Why would you use opals? Use these guys, but of course these only work on monsters that are not immune to dragon fire, i.e. not dragons. And then we have Onyx. It's basically the same as the Dragonstone Bakriminel bolts E. It has twice the chance of proccing. It does the same damage when it procs. However, it also heals you for 25% of whatever damage you do. So it's got a terrific effect which can be exploited massively in PvM scenarios, provided that you use it wisely. I would not use it throughout an entire kill of any boss monster, but in those niche situations, in those specific scenarios where you need the healing, definitely go for it. So it will do 4k damage per minute on average, and it will also heal you 4k damage per minute on average, which is very, very significant. However, the cost associated with that is that you have to cough up 35.6k GP per minute on average. So pretty significant there. And finally we have the Ascendri bolts or the Hydrix Bakriminel bolts, which both have the same effect. And again, I'm going to analyze that separately because it involves a lot of maths. So as I said, you can increase your proc chances by a flat 2% by completing the Elite Seer's Village tasks, and the numbers now on screen reflect that. So of course everything's increased. Happy days. Of course the costs have also increased because you're proccing more often, but I'm sure that wouldn't be a problem if it means you do more DPS and you also heal a bit more using the Onyx bolts. Now, why did I put the graphic for the Ascendri bolts instead of the Hydrix Bakriminel bolts? Well, they have the exact same effect, and if you use it with Ascensions, they have the exact same DPS as well. The only difference is the cost, of course, which is about 2k or 1.5k, something like that, for the same effect and the same extra DPS and the same extra adrenaline. So not much point using Hydrix at this point, not until Solak crossbows come out, of course, because Ascendri bolts are capped at T90 damage, whereas Hydrix is capped at up to T95 damage, depending on the level of your crossbow. Alright, so let's get right into the Ruby bolts analysis. So I must admit, I made a big faff of myself by trusting Jagex and trusting the tooltip icon. According to the tooltip icon, this is what I assumed was the case. The amount of damage that the Ruby bolts would do every time they procced, I thought would be 20% of whatever LP your monster was at. So for example, if it was at 200k LP, 20% of that is 40k. Of course you wouldn't do 40k, it's capped at 12k on monsters, so you do 12k. Following on from this, it means that the threshold between doing max damage and doing just below hard cap damage is 50k if you do a 10k hit, or if you do a 12k crit, it's 60k. So that's what I assumed, that's what I took into my calculations in the previous video. However, in reality, this is not the case. In reality, it's the following. So not only does the 20% scale according to the LP, you only do 20% of your monster's damage if that monster is at max HP. If it goes down, it will scale down linearly. You also have to account for another scaling. So these two combined is what you get with this calculator. So I spent a lot of time looking through this calculator and comparing it with in-game testing to see whether it was right, and it was right. So full credit goes to Chipapa and Sanguinista for creating this calculator. I highly recommend that you check it out if you want to look at how different HPs affect your threshold between doing max proc damage when Ruby Bolts proc and doing just below max. For example, at a boss which has 200k HP like Magister, the threshold is 100k. At a boss that has 100k HP like Hard Mode Armadillo, the threshold is 70k. So it's not linear by any means, so feel free to check it out. A very important thing to note is that this threshold is not absolute. It is affected by the things I mentioned earlier, such as prayers, boosted levels, Void Knight equipment, and the needle strike ability. So these will serve to do extra damage such that the actual threshold between doing 12k crits and doing just below 12k crits is lower than what this calculator actually says. Obviously, it's very hard to incorporate all of these things into the calculator because there's so many variables, but the calculator will give you an idea, and the actual LP threshold will be lower than what you expect. If that was confusing, don't worry, because I've incorporated these things into my calculations. So at Magister, like I said, the threshold is technically 100k. However, because of all these boosts, you still do 12k crits even when Magister is below 100k HP with all these boosts, such as your prayers, overloads, reckless aura perhaps, and also needle strike. And of course we have the corruption effect at Magister, which serves to do a plus 50% damage. So that's a massive boost in itself, specifically at Magister, not necessarily at other bosses. So for example, I did 10k procs when Magister was at 74k LP. I did a 5.8k proc when it just hit 50k LP. So Magister has this weird effect which is similar to Legio's. So even if it was at 50,001 LP, whatever hit you would have done, it's downgraded to 1 to get it down to 50. So that's a bit annoying, but whatever, that's the way things are. But at Magister, this LP threshold is far lower than the 100k mentioned in the calculator due to the things I mentioned. Now, Ruby Bolts also have another thing going for them, which is an attempt to nerf how good they are, which is that there is a minimum of 6 seconds between procs. However, this can be bypassed by using Ricochet. So if your bot procs while using Ricochet and it procs on the hit that was done to your secondary monster that Ricochet hit, then the 6-second cooldown does not apply. Also, you can bypass the cooldown by switching bots and switching back, which is a bit weird. It happened to me once or twice. It's difficult for me to say this is absolutely the case, but I'm pretty sure it is. They may fix it in the future because it is a way to bypass this 6-second cooldown. But one thing I can say is that the damage of the Ruby Bolts proc is capped at 24k on dummies and 12k on monsters when you're critting anyway. So 10k without a crit on monsters, and I assume 20k without a crit on dummies, although I'm not entirely sure. Incorporating these into the calculation, and assuming you've done this Elite Seers Village Diaries, we have the following numbers. So instead of 30 seconds between procs, it's now 36 seconds, of course, because of that 6-second cooldown on average, which means the effective proc chance is not 7%, but 5.47%, and the time between procs is not 21.43 seconds, but 27.43 seconds. Now, given the assumption that on average you do 4k damage per hit across all hits that actually count towards a proccing, that 4k will be converted to a 12k. And this is a key point to note, because the higher your original damage, the lower the extra damage that the Ruby Bolt spec would do, which is really counterintuitive. So with a lower level weapon, for example the Royal Crossbow, you will do more damage with the Ruby Bolt bolt spec than with a higher level weapon. This is because it will convert a 4K into a 12K, which is an 8K difference. With Ascension, say that 4K is a 3K with Royal Crossbows, that will do 9K instead. 9K difference between 3K and 12K, so it will do more damage when it procs. So that's pretty interesting, I suppose, but let's not go too much into that because you wouldn't want to use a lower level weapon just for these. Essentially, when you crunch the numbers, it means you do on average 10.94% more damage per hit or 17.5k more damage per minute. That is extraordinary. That's why these bolts are so overpowered, given the right conditions, of course. However, the flip side, of course, is that they will do 2.187k damage to yourself, to your own character. This can be lowered by keeping a low HP on your character. If you want to keep it at max HP, i.e. 10k HP, then it will do 2.187k damage per minute on average. Now with Death Swiftness, because your base damage is 6k, which is what I've assumed, the extra damage that you do is another 6k. So your extra DPS with these bolts specking is half as much as before. So the numbers are simply halved when you're using Death Swiftness. And if we assume that half the time you are Death Swiftness and half the time you're not, then you get these numbers. The magic number is around 13k extra damage per minute or 8.2% extra DPS as compared to Ascension bolts. Very interesting numbers, I gotta admit. There are a lot of things you can get out of these numbers in terms of where you should use these bolts, how you should use these bolts, and why these bolts are by far the best Bakriminel bolts for pure DPS. Because the next thing I'm going to come on to is Hydrix Bakriminel bolts or Ascendri bolts. Now, the currency that you use to measure these is not DPS or DPM, it is adrenaline, because their effect is that they grant an extra 10% adrenaline, which has a 10% chance of activating. And once that happens, for the next 15 seconds, you have a chance of getting an extra 1% adrenaline every time you use a basic ability. Completing the Seer's Village Diaries will increase your proc chance from 10% to 12% for these guys. And they have two proc effects, of course, the 10% adrenaline effect and the 1% adrenaline effect, which follows it for the next 10 attacks. So essentially, each time these guys proc, assuming you only use basics, you will get an extra 20% adrenaline spread out over the next 15 seconds. Pretty crazy stuff. And they have a 1 in 8 chance of proccing every time you use an ability. Really, really high chance, guys. These are pretty overpowered as well. If you average everything out, that's an extra 2.2% more adrenaline, assuming you're only using basics. And over the course of a planted feet Death Swiftness, that is 55.44% more adrenaline. And of course, these have to be incorporated into the threshold side of the calculation as well, which means when you're using thresholds, of course, you won't have the effect of 1% increased adrenaline for every hit that you do whenever it procs. That only applies to basics. So when you average it all out, it comes out to 46.62% extra adrenaline over the course of a planted feet Death Swiftness rotation, assuming you use basics for 65% of the time and thresholds for 35% of the time. Astonishing numbers, staggering numbers, guys, really are. And last but not least, we have the Diamond Bakriminel bolts. The speciality of these guys is that they are more and more effective as you're fighting something that's tankier and tankier. For example, let's start with something where you only have a 70% hit chance. Say Yakamaru without any affinity debuffs, no hammerers, no quakers, no gothic staffers. In this case, we have the following stats. So it has a 7% chance of proccing, and when it does proc, it does one of two things. The first thing it does is that you do 15% more damage on that hit. The second thing it does is that it guarantees the hit, i.e. your hit chance goes up to 100%. Now, if you grind through the maths, this turns out to, on average, increase your damage per hit by 1.05%, and it will also increase your hit chance on average from being 70 to becoming 72.10, i.e. increasing it by 2.10%. If you run these numbers through, it turns out that on average the increase in DPS, considering both damage and hit chance increase, is 4.08%, which is very high, but only because your base hit chance was 70%. Assuming you do 4k damage per hit, which is what I've assumed for this entire video, this turns out to be an extra 6.5k damage 6.5k extra damage per minute. That is fairly significant, not gonna lie. 4.08% is more than the amount of extra DPS you get from a tier 92 weapon versus a tier 90 weapon, if you saw some of my previous videos. If you apply these two progressively higher and higher base hit chances, such as 80, 90 and 100, you see these numbers drop down. It's not because of the damage. The increase in damage is always 15%, but because the difference between 180, 190 and 100 obviously gets smaller and smaller, the increase in overall DPS becomes smaller and smaller, capping out at 100% obviously, because when you have a base hit chance of 100%, there's not much point using Diamond Bakriminel bots. The only advantage you will gain from it is that 15% increased damage per proc. Nothing more than that. So what I'm trying to say is, use these if you are fighting something very, very tanky. Otherwise, probably not worth using. So yeah, again, very interesting numbers, and what we need to do now is to pull it all together to summarize these numbers. So let's assume you're fighting something with 80% hit chance, and half the time you're in a death swiftness, half the time you're not. 65% of all your attacks are basics and 35% are thresholds. Then you get the following numbers. And the key point to note is the total difference, the total DPS difference, which for Ruby bots is a whopping 8.2%. 8.2%, guys. Absolutely phenomenal. Coming in at second, a very close second between Diamond and Onyx. But Onyx wins out here with 3% extra DPS as compared to 2.82% extra DPS for the Diamonds. And the reason for this is that your base hit chance, which is 80%, is just about high enough to override the hit chance effect of Diamond Bakriminel bots. However, if you go down to 78, if your hit chance was 78, then this would not be the case. At 78% hit chance, the Diamond Bakriminel bots will have slightly higher DPS than Onyx. So that's sort of the threshold you're looking at as far as that's concerned. Of course, you can check out all the hit chances I'm talking about at specific bosses in my next video, but also if you want to look at it from a hit chance calculator point of view, Chipapa has made another one, so check out the description for that one. Hydrix, however, is possibly the best type of Bakriminel bots to use depending on the situation. 1.85% extra adrenaline on average every time you do an attack. So that's the summary of the Bakriminel bots with 80% hit chance on whatever monster you're fighting. Now, something you guys are probably interested in is to see how this compares with the DPS increase of different tiers of weapons and prayers. So we have the Hexhunter bow, which I analyzed in detail in 2 videos in the past. If we look at its DPS difference, assuming you're fighting something that its special effect actually works on, then because you only have 80% accuracy, even with Ascensions, with a tier 80 weapon, which is what the Hexhunter bow is, your accuracy is going to be even lower. So basically not worth using here in this scenario. However, the Seren God bow. Now, whenever we compare the Seren God bow to any of these bolts, we have to keep in mind that we're not accounting for the difference in DPS caused by mutated dazing shot and salt the wound versus needle strike. That is the key point to note whenever we consider the DPS difference between these two. All we're considering are the stats of the SGB, which will be exactly the same as the stats of the T92 Solak crossbows. So you can consider this comparison as a comparison between Ascension bolts with Ascension crossbows and Bakriminel bolts with tier 92 crossbows, i.e. Solak crossbows. Forget mutated dazing shot, forget needle strike, forget all of that stuff. Then the combined effect of a tier 92 in terms of accuracy and in terms of damage increase will give it a total DPS increase of 3.93% versus tier 90. That was gleaned in previous videos. The Desolation Curse, which is a tier 99 curse, if we consider that, how good that is, that's a 4.09% DPS increase. And if we combine both of them, tier 92 weapon and tier 99 curses, that's an 8.13% DPS increase as compared to tier 90 weapon and tier 95 curses. This was again covered in a very high level of detail in my tier 99 versus tier 92 comparison if you want to check that out as well. But essentially, all things considered, even when you're fighting a monster on which you only have an 80% base hit chance, Ruby bolts are still better until you hit the HP thresholds at which they stop hitting 12Ks and 10Ks and start hitting lower than that. So, Ruby bolts rock, guys. If you're fighting a tanky monster and you're looking at what you should be upgrading as far as when you're ranging something, most likely next, is it better for me to get the tier 99 curses? is it better for me to get the T92 SGB, or is it better for me to use Bakriminel bolts? The answer is Bakriminel bolts. Go for it. Now the other situation is when you're fighting something where you've got 100% hit chance against that thing. What we find is that the Hexhunter bow now comes into the picture, because of course if you're fighting something with such low defense that even with a tier 80 Hexhunter bow you have 100% hit chance, then of course its special effect will ensure that you get a 2.56% extra DPS with the Hexhunter bow as compared to Ascension bolts and Ascension crossbow. That's not enough though to out DPS the Ruby Bakriminel bolts, but it is enough to out DPS many of the other bolts except the Onyx bolts. And again, with the T92 and T99, any accuracy increase they could have granted you are basically not going to be considered here, because you have 100% base hit chance anyway, and therefore you can see that again the Ruby is ruling the roost here. It is absolutely head and shoulders above the rest, but for second place, it is a tight race between Onyx and T92 weapon and T99 cursors. Even though it looks like it's a pretty big gap of 3.55 versus 3.00, again remember this does not consider mutated dazing shot versus needle strike, and that number will be much closer, probably higher for the Onyx. And Onslaught. So I tried out Onslaught with Rubies, Onyxes and Hydrix to see which was the best one, with the goal of doing most damage with Onslaught overall. Firstly, with Ruby Bakriminel bolts, whenever they proc, you will do more damage with them, of course. However, it will also reduce the HP that your character has. Also consider that these only have a 7% chance of proccing versus the 12% of Onyx and Hydrix. When you put all that together, because of the negative effect to your LP of it proccing, and also when it procs at a later stage of your Onslaught, the extra damage it does is very small. Because for example, if without the proc you would have hit a 10k, with the proc you would only hit a 12k. So it only does 2k extra damage, and it also damages you for a lot more, which means you potentially do 1 or 2 fewer hits than you might have done without the Ruby bolts. So no, Ruby bolts are out of the question in my opinion. It comes down to Onyx versus Hydrix. So if you don't know how Onslaught worked, it takes away 25% of your adrenaline per hit, and when you go down to 0% adrenaline, it starts taking out 25% of whatever you hit from your own HP. So for example, if you hit a 10k, it will take off 2.5k from your HP until you die, or you cancel the effect. So I thought Hydrix would prevent any hit to you whenever the Hydrix spec procced, which gave you plus 10% adrenaline, but because it's not 25, it's only 10, it doesn't actually give you any advantage. That's what I found out with my test on dummies. What I thought was that it would, and it would make Hydrix the best type of Bakriminel bolts to use while onslaughting, but no, it doesn't, and therefore I think it is out of the question. So it leaves us with Onyx. So Onyx has the same chance of proccing as Hydrix, and because Onyx heals you for 25% of whatever you hit, whereas Onslaught damages you for 25% of whatever you hit, whenever Onyx procs while onslaughting, you will basically heal back what you get hit by the Onslaught self-damage, which is not just very handy, but it will grant you 1 or 2 extra hits, or has a potential to anyway. So say Onyx procced right at the end of your Onslaught when you were hitting 10k's, then it will heal you for a maximum of 2.5k, because that's capped, which means you can get another hit in there. It's not unreasonable for it to proc, because 12% chance is what, 1 in 8, so it will most probably proc at least once during your entire Onslaught. So that makes Onyx, in my opinion, the perfect switch to bring to bosses where you will be using Onslaught. Even though the cost is pretty high, but the cost is only high if you use it normally. It's not very high if you just switch to it during Onslaught. So that would be my conclusion for Onslaught. So I hope you enjoyed that analysis. In the next one, I intend to look at different bosses. I've already tested them out there. I just need to make the video to compare these Bakriminel bolts at different bosses to see which is the optimal strategy to use. You always want to be bringing a couple of bolts, possibly 3 bolts for switching, depending on the LP of your monster you're fighting, depending on the mechanics of the boss and so on. In general, however, these are the things I would say. You want to use rubies pretty much everywhere, especially at bosses with high HP, until you hit somewhere around the threshold that Chipap's calculator shows you, probably a bit less because it doesn't consider your other boosts, which will increase your damage anyway. The second thing I would say is that you want to use Hydrix bolts within Death Swiftness for two reasons. One, it will keep granting you extra adrenaline so you can keep doing extra damage, but two, rubies are not as effective inside of Death Swiftness because they don't do as much extra damage as they would outside of Death Swiftness. And number three, you have to look at the cost. The cost of Hydrixes and Onyxes is phenomenally high, ridiculously high. The cost of rubies, however, is much lower than you might expect. In fact, it's one of the lowest out of all of them. For some reason, ruby bots are cheaper than a lot of the other Bakriminel bots, so rubies are even more worth using because of this. So consider the cost before you start splashing out your cash. Use Hydrix and Onyx only in specific scenarios, like I mentioned, in order to optimize their effectiveness and minimize the amount of money you waste on them. And it's very important to know when to use normal Ascension bolts and when to use these special bolts, because in many situations you won't need to use the effects of any of these bolts, such as when you're fighting, say, minions at Nex or Reavers at AOD, but yeah, just some general pointers there. I hope you enjoyed the video overall. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I will see you in the next one.